Back in the days before the apocalypse, I often traveled back east. And, you know, back east is that mysterious region that lies somewhere between Texas and France. Okay, why isn't that advancing? There it is. And strange things happen back there. And one of them is this, that back east, there's this stuff that comes out of the sky, sometimes without warning, and it gets all over your clothes, and it gets all over your hair, and it gets all over your windshield, and it has deleterious and beneficial effects. It makes the grass green, and it makes the cows happy. And they also have rivers back east that have water in them at all times of the year, which is a very strange thing indeed. Here in the West, we know better, of course. We keep our water stored underground, and we have different ideas about how rivers ought to behave. Because water does not fall from the sky all the time, water does not flow all the time. And when it does, we sometimes seem as if we had never seen it before. Lake Elmira, as we call it here in Tucson. But the strange thing is, we have ignored the fact that we live in a dry place. For a couple of hundred years now, we've ignored that fact or tried to wish it away. And instead, we've behaved as if our rivers have been full from bank to bank year round. And therein lies the tale of a river called the Gila, a tale that begins a long, long time ago. Most rivers are babies in geological time. They're infants. The Colorado cut through the Grand Canyon only over the last few million years, and the Mississippi formed the last major fingers of its meandering course during the last glacial period, which ended only, 10,000 or so years ago. And it's still changing its course to this day. The Gila, in its course, its present course, is just a few million years old, twinkling on the big scale of earthly time. But it's also very ancient. Now, beginning about 150 million years ago, the site of much of the present-day Gila drainage, along with most of what is now Western North America, lay behind a vast salt lake that was dammed up by a block of mountains along the Pacific coast, as you can see. The Gila began its life as a southerly outlet of that ancient sea, and its waters drained by the ancestral Rio Grande. To the east, and to the Salton Trough to the west, and that cut south about 20 million years ago in order to form what is now the Gulf of California. Excuse me, all right, now I'm in trouble. All right, sorry. About 30 million years ago, the Moghian Highlands, which are to the north and east of, I assume, most of us in this conversation, they rose to their present height roughly of 8,000 to 11,000 feet. And that high country contains about half of the course of the present-day Gila River, which is born in the ice caves and streams in the wild mountains above Silver City and Glenwood, New Mexico. Country so wild that they're the site of the first federally designated wilderness in the United States. Dan Schilling will tell you more about that in his talk. A couple more photographs just to show you how beautiful and imposing that country is. Below these highlands and their foothills, the land lowers and broadens, and the mountains become fewer and generally smaller, and separating them are wide desert valleys, basin and range. And they run all the way to the Gila's confluence with the Colorado River, some 600 miles from the headwaters, as you can see there. And over millions of years, water flowed from the Moghian Highlands to the Colorado River. And that water kept its own rhythms, varying with the amount of rain that blew in. And over time, it established a certain regularity. And the Gila and its principal tributaries, which are from east to west, the San Francisco, the San Carlos, the San Pedro, the Salt, the Verde, the Agua Fria, and the Hassayampa rivers. And collectively, they predictably carried about 3 to 4 million acre feet of water a year. And for desert country, that's a huge blessing. An acre foot of water is about 345,000 gallons. So that's enough water to cover an acre of land to the depth of a foot, or to sustain an average American family of 3 or 4 for about a year. And that's a figure we'll want to keep in mind as we consider the human history of this place. So we'll move from the geological to the human now. Just when the first peoples came into this river country, no one knows. You know, when I was a graduate student 100 years ago, it was almost a matter of religious faith that 10,000 years ago, you could set your watch by it. 10,000 years ago, Paleo Indians, as they were called, came to this place. And now we're pushing that date back, 12,000, 15,000. Some scholars are even looking in the range of 20 and 25,000. Ancient, far more ancient than we thought. But when they came here, in whatever case, they came to a region that looked far different than it does today. The Sonoran Desert down to the floor was carpeted with ponderosa pine and alligator juniper, and plants that are now found much higher up. And the annual rainfall in this low country was more than 40 inches, which is about what Iowa receives now. And the mountains received nearly twice that much rain constantly. But as the last ice age began its retreat 10,000 odd years ago, in a period of global warming, and there's a timely term, the face of the continent began to change. And along the Gila, those great forests began to retreat up the mountainsides. And the drier lowlands gave themselves over to the cacti and other vegetation that we associate with them today. Plants, many of which first evolved in wet places and adapted to these new drier conditions. And with that climate change, perhaps 7,500 years ago, these Paleo-Indian nomads made their way up into the mountains of the upper Gila, up into that high country, where it had been too cold to settle in the centuries before. And they settled. And the places that they built still dot the landscapes of the upper river. And that's an area that we say belongs to the Moghian culture area. And over the generations, these Moghian people gained an important advantage. And that was from traders who traveled along the Sierra Madre corridor from the Valley of Mexico all the way up, came corn, first domesticated in the Valley of Mexico, and squash, beans, and peppers soon followed, the three sisters. And the Moghian traded food, seeds, and agricultural technologies of the time with people downriver. And one of those peoples downriver, closest to the Moghian themselves, made a specialty out of growing agaves and cultivating agaves, succulent plant that provides fiber, food, building materials, very versatile plant. And of course, it also provides very interesting things to drink. And that's the basis of a trade. You know, hey, I'll give you corn and beans, you give me something to drink. And it all works out very nicely. The culture of these moonshiners who lived in the country between the Moghian and the Hohokam heartlands, we don't know a whole lot about those people, but we can see their remains if you drive out around San Carlos Lake. You can see the remains in the form of agricultural terraces that you have to use a little imagination because they're pretty weathered, but if you look at the hillsides, you see the terraces where these agaves had been grown. And I expect they did a very good business in their day, because one thing that we do know for sure from history is that everybody enjoys a jug from time to time. So, and at the confluence of the Gila and the Colorado, the Patayan culture similarly is something of a blank in regional history. Such material evidence for the Patayan as exists often lies buried underneath meters of silt, because those people lived on floodplains in fairly simple brush huts, and they were periodically swept away in flooding. They were the last of the southwestern peoples to take up settled agriculture of any kind, and it was based on floodwater farming. So again, you hope that the river rises enough to give you enough water to irrigate your fields, but not to tear it away. And when the rivers did not rise, as happened from time to time, the people starved. And during a great period of drought and starvation and warfare, probably some of them picked up and moved to the eastern mountains at the eastern edge of their range in the highlands around Flagstaff and Prescott. And those are the ancestors, it is thought, of the Hualapai, the Havasupai, the Yavapai peoples of today. But by contrast, the Hohokam culture of the middle Gila, they lived on Easy Street. They were based their economy on a very sophisticated knowledge of how water works and how it can be moved and controlled. And the Hohokam built an elaborate network of irrigation canals along a great plain that stretches out westward from North Butte and South Butte over by Florence to a point east of present-day Gila Bend, Arizona, punctuated by administrative centers and towns such as what is now called Casa Grande Ruins National Monument. And these hundreds of miles of canals allowed for year-round farming, which freed the Hohokam people particularly from the old cycles of feast and famine that governed the lives of people who gathered and hunted instead of farmed. So many ancient peoples in the world who were dependent on a less regular sources of food and sometimes suffered the consequences. But the early Hohokam were growing, and there's a great scholarly controversy about what actually constitutes Hohokam. We were going to skip over all that. But people were farming along the Gila and along the Santa Cruz and various other rivers in this region at least 4,000 years ago. But very highly developed agricultural civilization really began to rise about 1800 or so years ago. That's the time you see permanent settlement, permanent fields, and large settlements like Snaketown, which is, if you take Riggs Road, the back road into the western valley of Phoenix, the Beltline, you can sort of see, well, you'll see some creosote bush, and underneath it is Snaketown. That whole canal system sustained a population that may have numbered as many as 60,000 people at the peak of Hohokam civilization, and they afforded the wealth to sustain a great period of building that included ball courts, platform mounds, possibly even pyramids. And it was that achievement that caused a 19th century immigrant to Arizona to proclaim the founding of a new city on the site of those old canals, a place that he called Phoenix because it rose up from the ashes of a former civilization. But in Snaketown and similar cities of the Hohokam world, lay the seeds of that culture's destruction in a kind of a roundabout way. Urban populations began to grow, and that added pressure to expand agriculture and to expand the canal system into marginal areas farther and farther away from the river itself, the source of that flowing water. And so much of the river was diverted into irrigation canals that it increased the likelihood of periodic failures of those canals when the rivers didn't flow. Sometimes the Gila flowed too much. And when that happened in the 9th century, massive floods along the Gila and its tributaries in the Phoenix area destroyed hundreds of miles of Hohokam irrigation canals. And a famine followed that may have lasted for a whole decade. But in time, the entire Southwest endured a great drought that lasted for, perhaps a century. And the civilizations of the Southwest imploded. There was no way that the population centers could hold given the conditions of the time. The Moghian people left their cliff dwellings and their pit houses, and they wandered away, and the Hohokam cities became ghost towns. But the people of the Gila, of course, did not vanish. Some of those Moghian people made their way north, and they intermarried with other peoples. And some archaeologists believe them to be the ancestors of the Zuni people to the north and the Tarahumara people to the south. The desert Hohokam became the Tohono O'odham, the people of the desert place. The river Hohokam became the Akimel O'odham, the running water people. And they eventually cleared out the old irrigation canals that ran through places like Snaketown and Sacaton, and they resumed farming. Excuse me, I got a little bit behind there, the old Pima Villages there. West of O'odham country lay the territory of human-speaking peoples who had come in after the Patayan, such as the Cocopa and the Quechan, who grew crops and fished for trout and squawfish on the Gila and the Colorado. This is a picture of the confluence that I took about 8 months ago, I guess, when there was that strange thing called rain that came down and filled the water. But some of the Yuma people, and Gila, it's thought, comes from a Yuma phrase that I'm not even going to try to mangle the pronunciation, but means salty water running, which is a perfect description for it down in that part of the river. Some of those Yuma people were given to a highly ritualized kind of warfare, and it was frequent enough and severe enough that it caused some of their neighbors to move, like the Patayan had, to move to the middle Gila. And on arriving at what came to be called the Pima Villages, the painting that we saw just a minute ago, the refugees petitioned the Akimel O'odham, the river people, for sanctuary, and they were allowed to establish villages west of where the Salt and Gila rivers meet, and to the south as well. And they were called, the Akimel O'odham called them people of the strange ways. And they did so because those people had curious ideas about what the work week constituted. Also, they like to decorate themselves with butterflies, and we call them maricopa, mangling of the Spanish word mariposa, butterfly, for the way that the Halchidoma painted their faces. And as I say, the maricopa's customs may have seemed strange to their hardworking, schedule-keeping farmers among the Akimel O'odham, since the maricopa preferred hunting to farming, and they took a couple of months off every year, July when it was too hot to work, and December when, by their reckoning, it was too cold. But still, eventually, they took on the habits of their neighbors, and today, Maricopa farms, extensive Maricopa farms, dot the landscape to the south and the west of the Phoenix area now. Well, down in Yuma world and up the river, war and peace and war ensued, and peace finally came to the western desert at a time that we're not entirely sure actually happened, but marked by a boundary between Hachidoma and Yuman territory at a place we call Painted Rock State Park, thought to mark a treaty division between these two groups of people. And the peace that they established, it's believed, held for some generations. And it was broken every now and again between outbursts of raiding and one last instance of intertribal warfare, which occurred in late 1857, as late as that, when several hundred Quechan and Mojave warriors marched up the Gila River and attacked the Hachidoma settlement that was closest to the Pima Villages. And it was a bloody, ugly battle, and half of the invaders were killed, and many of the people who lived there were killed as well. But those human raids would seem insignificant compared to those visited on the people of the Gila by newcomers from the north. And they called themselves Dine or Ende or Dene, the people, excuse me, but they are better known as the Apache. Excuse me, which is a word that derives from the Zuni word for enemy. And those Apaches settled in the highlands along the headwaters of the Gila, coming to control that territory, and they branched out to control nearly the entire length of the Moghian Rim. And there they found abundant food and green forests, and they must have thought they found paradise, because in Apache cosmology, the afterlife is divided into a green and mountainous place for good people and a flat, hot place for bad people, like where some of us live down here in the desert. Excuse me. So, early in March of 1536, and Norm may have told you, when I give you these dates like this, they will be on the quiz, so be attentive to them. March 1536, 4 men dressed in tattered animal skins arrived at the gates of a ranch down in Sonora in Mexico. And their 44-year-old leader told a fantastic story. His name was Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and his companions were Andres Dorantes de Carranza and Alonso de Castillo Maldonado, and they were accompanied by Dorantes's servant, was the nice word they used, enslaved person probably, who had recently been more or less freed. They called him Estebanico. And they had walked from the coast of Texas, where they had been shipwrecked 8 years earlier, their story went. And there were 300 of them at the start. And they saw and they did miraculous things, Cabeza de Vaca told the audience at that ranch. He said they had raised Indians from the grave, and they had cured blindness, and they'd been hailed as gods, and they were given, Cabeza de Vaca recounted, beads made from coral from the South Sea and fine turquoise from the north. In fact, everything the Indians had, including the fine gift to me of 5 emerald arrowheads. And that was pretty interesting to the people who heard that. And they said, well, can we see it? And Cabeza de Vaca probably said something like, I probably left it in my other animal skin because I can't show it to you right now, but I'll show you later. But his listeners did pay even closer attention when he said, oh yeah, by the way, the Indians we encountered to the north along this river, they pointed to the direction of 7 fabulous cities made entirely of gold. Their name was Cibola, and they're supposed to look something like this. And you know, some people believed it and some people didn't. And the ones who didn't kind of won out in the end, because Cabeza de Vaca was accused of sorcery and he was deported to Spain after a while. But 3 years later, another man, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, who was the governor of the province of Nueva Galicia, he dispatched Estevanico and Friar Marcos de Niza. And he told them to locate these cities of gold. And de Niza returned several months later, and he had mixed reports, good news and bad news. He said, the good news is, oh yeah, we found the cities of gold, and the bad news is that along the way, Estevanico had been killed for rather complex reasons by native peoples that they had encountered. Well, Coronado his attention was fixed on all those points. And he, on February 22nd, 1540, he set out with another 300 Spanish soldiers and 1,000 Indian bearers. And they crossed rivers and mountains, including the Gila, we think. And following de Niza's map, they continued onward until they reached a dusty village that they called Chihuahua, that was called Chihuahua. It's a word Spanish ears heard wishfully thinking, I guess, as Cibola, Chihuahua, actually the name for what we call Zuni. And it was not made of gold. It was instead, Coronado reported, a small rocky pueblo, all crumpled up. So he was pretty disappointed. And he led his force down the Rio Grande. And there a Tiwa Indian told him of a great city far to the east called Quivira. Quivira, that's sort of like Cibola, right? And so Coronado headed that way. For 2 years, he and his men, steadily dwindling in number, trod the Great Plains, searching for the cities. And finally, in northwestern Kansas, you can see on the map, the very close to Salina and Topeka, which was the supposed site of Quivira. Topeka doesn't sound anything like Cibola, but whatever the case, at that point, Coronado took a bad fall from his horse, and after which he turned his handful of surviving troops back to Mexico. Said, that's it. That's enough. And they went back to Culiacan, and there he died at the age of 44. But Quivira, Cibola, lay still in the minds of a lot of the people in New Spain, Nueva Galicia, and other places. And over the next several decades, the Spanish staged various military reconnaissances into the Gila Basin. In 1598, a governor named Juan de Oñate drove herds of cattle and sheep into the Gila drainage, where the native grasses, he said, stood as tall as a man on horseback. And soon, small ranches began to spring up, small ranches and farms along the Gila's headwaters, and they were mostly staffed by Pueblo people from northern New Mexico. Since the Apaches typically could not be induced to come down and do that work for the Spanish. When they left the highlands, though, they did help themselves to the Spanish herds, and creating a state of warfare between the Spanish crown and Apache peoples for a very long time. Apache raids kept the Spanish settlers confined to the lowlands, despite well-organized campaigns by soldiers like Don Juan Ignacio Flores de Moghian, for whom the Moghian Rim is named. For the next couple of centuries, the Spanish, though, they steered clear of the area, they steered clear of the Gila region. Alarmed by French incursions into the Great Plains, though, the Spanish crown ordered the creation of a series of outposts on the northern frontier of New Spain. And in that connection, a Jesuit priest named Eusebio Francisco Kino came there in 1687. Interesting guy. He was born in Italy, spoke German as a child, went to work for the Spanish. And he established missions, which were a combination of church, ranch, farm, and fortress from northern Sonora to a point about 70 miles below the Gila on the Santa Cruz. And Kino traveled the length of the river a dozen times, extending what he called the rim of Christendom as far as he could. And of the Maricopas, excuse me, he encountered at the far northern end of that domain, he wrote, in some places they gave us so much and so very good fish that we gave it as a ration to the men, just as beef is given where it is plentiful. If you're a fan of fishing, you probably aren't going to pull a catch like that out of the Gila these days. But Spain's days were waning, though. It had squandered its wealth, taken from the fields and the mines of the New World in a century of wars. And Mexico achieved independence in 1821. Spanish forces withdrew. The legacy was this chain of missions, abandoned cattle and horses, and a mestizo, a mixed Spanish and native population that probably numbered no more than 2,000 across the entire Gila Basin. In the early fall of 1824, a party of American trappers petitioned the Mexican governor of Santa Fe for a license to trap beaver along the Gila. The governor agreed, and the party went along the river. Among its younger was a young man named James Ohio Patty, who was probably the first Anglo-American to see the Colorado Delta and the Grand Canyon. And for nearly 2 years, that party traveled the length of the river, killing thousands of beaver and having an unsightly number of run-ins with native people who were a little unhappy about what they were doing. And other trappers followed, men like Bill Williams and Kit Carson, who came to the Gila, and Carson said, found it the freest country on earth at that time. No civilization, no laws, no books. Made him very happy. But soon the beaver were all gone, and their demise coincided with the arrival of thousands of Anglos to the Gila Basin, most of them westward bound, thanks to the discovery of gold at John Augustus Sutter's California sawmill on January 24th, 1848. And just 12 days later, the governments of the United States and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded the Southwest and California to the Americans who were victorious in the Mexican War. And for the next 4 years, as you can see at the bottom of this, the Gila River formed part of the boundary between those two nations and an important part of the overland route that thousands of 49ers followed to the California gold fields. And that Gila route had been mapped out across the desert during the Mexican War, the Mexican-American War, when the Mormon battalion, so-called, traveled through what was then northern Sonora. This is a monument marking the Battle of the Bulls, which was where some of those abandoned Spanish cattle, which had turned feral, decided to attack the column that was passing by them. And they had a big barbecue that night. Along the way, the Mormon battalion camped near the Pima Villages, and the Mormon commander, he was so impressed by their hospitality that he wrote to Brigham Young to propose that those villages become the final destination of the coming Mormon migration from Illinois. And Young had chosen Utah, but he recognized Arizona as an important destination too. And more miners came through Arizona, and then farmers, including in the early days large numbers of those Mormon farmers who established colonies and farmsteads along the middle Gila, the largest settlement of Mormons outside of Utah. And within a dozen years of their arrival, the new farmers had dammed the Gila at various spots, and their engineering projects proved so successful that by 1873, the Akimel-O'odham, the river people, 7 years earlier, they had sold the United States Army 5 million pounds of surplus wheat from their fields in the Gila at the Pima Villages. By 1873, they couldn't irrigate their fields sufficiently to feed themselves, much less have any surplus. And a delegation of Akimel-O'odham traveled to Washington, where they asked for water and the rights to the water that they had had. And President Ulysses S. Grant said, no, why don't you move to Oklahoma instead? And it was not a winning proposition. The Apache Wars were still raging, and Grant disliked the prospect of making new enemies, but as the Apaches in time were defeated, any promises about water that had been made fell off the table, and water flowed farther and farther away from the river people, the Akimel-O'odham. And recalled one of them who had a grocery store at Gila Crossing. There the river was once 3/4 of a mile wide. And he wrote in his memoir, the green of the Pima fields spread along the river for many miles. In the old days, when there was plenty of water. Now the river is an empty bed full of sand. Now you can stand in that place and see the wind tearing pieces of bark off the cottonwood trees as they grow along the dry ditches. The dead trees stand there like white bones. The red-winged blackbirds have gone somewhere else. Mesquite and brush and tumbleweeds have begun to turn our Pima fields back into desert. Now you can look across the valley and see the green alfalfa and cotton spreading for miles on the farms of white people who irrigate their land with hundreds of pumps running night and day. Some of those farms take their water from ditches dug hundreds of years ago by us Pimas, or the ancestors of the Pimas. Over there, across the valley, is where the red-winged blackbirds are singing today. The Gila began to dry up even further with the arrival of large corporate farms whose crops included plants that were not well suited to the desert, at least when grown on an industrial scale, like Egyptian cotton and soft wheat and citrus and pecans. At about the same time, developers advertising in national farming magazines called for individual farmers to come. They said they're wanted all along the middle Gila. They claimed these ads that the region enjoyed, and I'm quoting, underground reservoirs of unlimited volume, lost rivers, hidden streams that could never be exhausted. Well, water, as the Western saying goes, flows uphill toward money. And more farmers and farm workers came, and they founded towns like Coolidge and Casa Grande. And the advent of World War I brought worldwide demand for long staple cotton that was used in clothing and tires and airplane fabrics, munitions. Developers had already begun to buy out small farms all along the middle Gila by 1910, anticipating the completion of Roosevelt Dam on the Salt tributary, and by 1920, cotton grew on 200,000 acres of land along the Salt and the Gila, and the acreage tripled a decade later. And that large-scale farming began to change the landscape. And so did the introduction of large-scale cattle ranching to the region. In 1870, it's estimated, there were no more than 5,000 head of cattle in Arizona territory. By 1891, so 21 years later, there were at least 3 million. And within the space of a few years, grazing herds had gnawed the grasslands that grew alongside the river to the ground. And the man who introduced longhorn cattle to Arizona, who was a forester and a former Apache fighter named Will Barnes, he said, "We fondly imagined that these wonderful ranges would last forever and couldn't be overstocked." And he added, "We were wrong." Drought came to the Gila once again in 1892, and it settled in for a full decade. And as a rancher later reminisced, a person could actually throw a rock from one carcass to another across the entire length of southern New Mexico and Arizona. And 2 million of those 3 million cattle died. When Anglo-Americans first came to the Southwest, much of the Gila River was navigable. Within half a century, it no longer carried enough water to float a raft, and that was a source of considerable confusion for newcomers who had read about the abundant waters of the desert, went out there looking for land to buy. Think of when Claude Rains asks Humphrey Bogart why he came to Casablanca, and Bogart says, "For the waters." And Rains replies, "Waters? There are no waters in Casablanca." And Bogart replies, "I was misinformed." Yeah, people were misinformed. In 1944, 25 German sailors who had been interned as prisoners of war in Papago Park in Tempe tunneled out of their camp, and they planned to steal a boat and sail down the Gila to Mexico. And the maps that they had acquired somehow showed it to be a perennial river, marked in blue. And when they reached the banks and they saw only sand, they headed off on foot. And within 2 days, almost all of them were rounded up, and their captain was mightily vexed, let's say. He was really mad. He said, "I only wish that the Gila really had been a river. If it has no water, why do the Americans show it on their maps?" He was very unhappy about that. Yeah, why do we show it on our maps if there's no water in it? Farms, ranches, mines, and now suddenly more and more and more people began to arrive in the Southwest. The Indian War is over. The World War is over. The cities began to grow, and with them demand for water, of course. And Southwestern boosters in the early years lost no time in turning to Washington as the solution for their problem. They demanded that this conquest be put into motion, the conquest of water. One of them was a man named A.J. Chandler, for whom the Arizona city near the Gila is named. And he had gone to Europe in 1893 to try to raise capital for a dam that would span the Gila across the Twin Buttes by Florence. A vast, would have been one of the biggest dams on earth. Then he tried to raise money for the present Roosevelt dam. He finally succeeded in getting the federal government to pay for that by lobbying for the National Reclamation Act of 1902, and other dams went up along the Gila, such as Coolidge Dam near the San Carlos Apache Reservation. And that was completed in 1930, and the dam created a reservoir that by then filled so slowly, painfully slowly, that Will Rogers, who came out for the dedication, remarked, "If this was my lake, I'd mow it." So we'll fast forward to the present, when through the magic of robbing Peter to pay Paul, we have lakes and golf courses and huge housing developments. If you know your Greek mythology, by the way, you know you don't want to live in the house of Atreus. 1990, Phoenix ranked as the 9th largest city in the United States. In 2000, it was the 6th largest. It's now the 5th largest. And all those people are thirsty. And the Gila is increasingly dry. And some planners have suggested building new canals, as if we were a superpower ho-ho-cum, that would tap into the Columbia River and the Mississippi River and bring water all the way across the country from there. Some suggest seeding the clouds. Some suggest floating icebergs from the Arctic by fast tugboats and bringing the meltwater inland. But it seems now that those icebergs are melting on their own, so that's probably not going to work out. Well, we have been on a long journey here. Some of you may be thinking that we've been on too long a journey, but in any event, we've traveled across hundreds of miles and millions of years and viewed the Gila River in many different ways. And now we find it not to be much of a river at all. Excuse me. Will we ever see it flow again freely? We can dream. It's possible, but for that to happen, we'll all have to rethink our view of natural resources, recognizing them for what they are, which is precious gifts and not birthrights, and easily taken back. Water belongs in rivers from bank to bank, and rain should fall from the sky. Well, they have strange things back east, as I started off by saying. Maybe the idea of a flowing Gila should be counted as one of those strange things, but it's one that I think is worth thinking about. So.